Until 1945, the Reich Chancellery stood at the place where today the street an der Kolonnade meets Wilhelmstraße. The Chancellery was originally built in 1739 as an aristocratic Baroque palais, and it was eventually bought by the Prussian government following an initiative by Otto von Bismarck, who wanted to prevent its demolition and to have it refurbished as his headquarters. Renovations were finally completed in 1878, and Bismarck took up residence in the building, which from now on housed what was then called the Central Office of the Reich Chancellor. At Bismarck's suggestion, the name of the building was changed to Reich Chancellery. In the same year, a Congress met under Bismarck's mediation in the reception hall of the Chancellery to discuss the problems in the Balkans, and so the old aristocratic residence played its first role in international politics. In January 1933, Hitler was ready to move into the Reich Chancellery. To demonstrate his claim to power, he had been living close to the Chancellery in the Hotel Kaiserhof for over a year. He wished to associate himself with power through proximity. So when Reichspräsident Hindenburg appointed Hitler Reich Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, the physical distance to the Chancellery was not far. However, Hitler's goals were worlds apart from the political tradition of the Reich Chancellery. Perhaps this is why he felt the need to use a car to cross the few hundred meters over Wilhelmplatz from the Hotel Kaiserhof to the Chancellery. This statue of General von Zieten in the foreground was one of 6 bronze statues on the square. The statues were created by Johann Gottfried Schadow and were placed at the 6 entrances to the square facing outward. Coming into view on the right is the Reich's Press Office, which in March 1933 would become Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. Like the extension to the Reich Chancellery, shown here on the left, the view of the propaganda ministry was obscured by a double row of trees. These trees circled the entire Wilhelmplatz, and by the early 1930s they had become so large that the facades of the buildings on the square could hardly be seen. Behind this statue of General Count of Schwerin, one can see a structure covered in natural stone cladding. This is the extension to the Reich Chancellery, which was constructed towards the end of the 1920s by the architect Dr. Eduard Jobst Siedler and engineer Robert Kisch. The building, which was very controversial for its time, was built on an empty plot which had made Wilhelmplatz seem unfinished for years. Even though the extension was built in a very modern style, it formed a successful visual bridge between the buildings that flanked it. Since President Hindenburg himself was temporarily using the Reich Chancellor's apartment in the Chancellery, Hitler had to live in an apartment in this extension after his inauguration as Chancellor. In the autumn of 1933, Hitler instructed his architect from Munich, Paul Ludwig Troost, to refurbish the Reich Chancellery and the Reich Chancellor's apartment. These alterations made no visible exterior changes to the building, since Hitler placed great importance on a public appearance of modesty and wanted to avoid accusations of unnecessary government spending. However, when it came to the renovation of the interior of the Chancellery, no expense was spared. Since Troost came from Munich, he experienced difficulties with organizing the building site in Berlin. Joseph Goebbels then remembered that a young architect had recently completed a winter garden for his Berlin villa in record time. The architect, 28-year-old Albert Speer, was promptly charged with the supervision of the renovations at the Chancellery. The entire Chancellery was refurnished by Troost with pieces from a specialized workshop in Munich. Paul Ludwig Troost died before the renovation was completed, and his wife, Gerdi Troost, completed the project. For Albert Speer, the year 1934 marked a turning point in his life. It was at this time, here on the site of the Reich Chancellery, that he first met Adolf Hitler. Hitler regularly visited the site to view the progress of the renovations, and he took an immediate liking to the young architect. Soon Speer would continue the work that Trost began, the development of a National Socialist architectural style based on the classical. This would eventually lead to the most ambitious architectural project of his life, the redesign of Berlin into the new Reich's capital, Germania. Only 1 year after the extensive renovations in the Reich Chancellery, Hitler declared himself unsatisfied with the recently refurbished reception hall of the Chancellery, and he commissioned the construction of a larger reception hall in the Chancellery garden. But perhaps the alleged need for a larger hall was simply an excuse for what Hitler wanted to construct beneath the new building. Hitler had ambitious plans for Germany, plans which would ultimately lead to the death of millions of people and the destruction of all but one of the buildings in this documentary. And since Hitler knew the path down which his agenda would lead him, he knew that the next most important structure the Reich Chancellery would need was an air raid shelter. In 1934, as part of Trost's renovations, he built a winter garden with a roof terrace in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Although the new air raid shelter was planned for the use of all the residents of the Chancellery, it was constructed where Hitler himself would have the most direct access to it, in the garden right next to the Reich Chancellor's apartment. Despite Trost's death, the contract for the construction of the reception hall was once again awarded to his Munich office. Trost's former partner Leonhard Gall seemed to Hitler at this time still better suited to design the hall than his protégé Albert Speer. The bunker was constructed in the center of the reception hall's basement. The shelter had a 1.6-meter thick ceiling made of reinforced concrete and was equipped with state-of-the-art safety features. At the time of its construction, the bunker, with its thick ceiling, its independent energy supply, and its integrated gas protection system, was one of the safest shelters in the German Reich. A cutaway model shows how the bunker and the reception hall were structurally integrated. The marble pillars of the hall reached through the resonance space underneath the floor to rest directly on the bunker walls. The hall served as a perfect disguise for the bunker, and also offered Hitler a stage for his diplomatic receptions. The festive guests would have had no idea that they were actually dancing on top of Adolf Hitler's bunker. For Albert Speer, the reception hall, completed by Leonhard Gall in 1936, was an object for special study. Here, he had the opportunity of studying Adolf Hitler's architectural preferences without even having to risk criticism of one of his own designs. Speer would now copy the interior atmosphere of the new winter garden and reception hall to the majority of his new buildings. As Trost had done before him, Speer would base the facades of his buildings on the classical style. It was in 1944 that the importance Hitler attached to the reception hall became clear. When the bunker was expanded and reinforced after the first major bomb attacks, the changes had to be limited to what could be done without causing permanent damage to the hall. Under Soviet occupation after 1945, the reception hall and chancellery were entirely demolished. Thus, orientation is difficult at the former site of Hitler's Berlin headquarters. To experience what this exact spot would look like today, one would walk down the left side of the present-day road An der Kolonnade towards Wilhelm Street. But even if the Reich Chancellery was still standing today, the view would be very different to what is seen here. The Bismarck Passage, for example, which can be seen here, was later demolished by Albert Speer during one of his construction projects. This will be discussed in more detail later. In 1935, when Leonhard Gall was commissioned to build the new reception hall, Hitler approached Speer with a sketch he had made for a balcony. It became Speer's task to turn Hitler's idea into reality. Speer built the so-called Führerbalkon in front of two of the windows of Hitler's office in the extension building to the Reich Chancellery. From here, Hitler could now show himself to the crowds on Wilhelmplatz. Even though it was only built in 1935, Goebbels' propaganda dated the balcony's construction to 1933 in order to inextricably link it with Hitler's coming to power. Even after the war and through his years in prison, Speer continued to claim that the balcony was built in 1933. But Hitler's plans for the Reich Chancellery did not end with the construction of the Führerbalkon. The time for building in secret and hiding his projects from the public eye in the garden of the Chancellery to avoid criticism was now over. And so in early 1936, Hitler charged Speer with the task of constructing a new Reich Chancellery. Since 1935, the German Reich had begun to buy up the properties on Voss Street, as per instruction from the Chancellery. Here, Hitler wished to construct a magnificent building that could serve as a center and symbol of Nazi power, and from which he would direct his expansionist policies. Hitler saw the buildings on the northern side of Voss Street, neighboring the Chancellery, as not representative enough for the government district. Also likely to have played a role in Hitler's decision was the fact that the buildings on Voss Street overlooked the Chancellery gardens. Speer had the old buildings demolished between 1936 and 1937. The low height of the new Reich Chancellery, coupled with the widening of the road, fundamentally changed the character of the street. Now it no longer appeared as a narrow alley in the heart of the government district. Speer planned to demolish the building on the southern side of the street as well, to allow for the road to be widened even further. But these plans were never carried out, and the new Reich Chancellery could never be seen in its intended surroundings as Speer had envisioned it in 1936. The only changes visible from Wilhelmplatz in connection with the new Reich Chancellery was a double door added to the extension building. From Wilhelmplatz, the new construction could hardly be seen. Hitler did not want any drastic changes to be made to the square. Thus, the facades of Borsigpalais, seen here on the right, were integrated into the design of the new Reich Chancellery. Speer designed the section of the Chancellery which bordered Borsigpalais to serve as an optical bridge between the old and the new buildings. The window size and the layout of the facade of Borsigpalais were continued in this section, which ended in an entrance portal. The portal, with its contrasting layout and materials, served to soften the discrepancy between the two-level Borsigpalais and the three-level new Reich Chancellery. Flanked by the eastern and western administration blocks, seen here in the background, the so-called Mittelbau was located in the center of the new Reich Chancellery. This building was the seat of Hitler's power. It is strange that here, in the heart of the new Reich Chancellery, a public air raid shelter was located. 5 separate shelters could be accessed from hydraulic doors which were built into the pavement in front of the building. This is an unusual combination of government headquarters and public space. Behind these windows lay the marble gallery through which the great reception hall, the Reich's cabinet room, and Hitler's office could be reached. Presumably, the location of the public air raid shelter underneath Hitler's office was intended to give the people a feeling of protection, to make them feel that they were directly connected to Hitler's person. The importance of the Mittelbau in the general ensemble of the new Reich Chancellery was also underlined by the building features created by the sculptor Kurt Schmidt-Ehmen. Seen here is the eagle above the entrance portal to the eastern administrative block, to the right of Mittelbau. The eagle's head is turned to face towards Mittelbau, directing the gaze of the viewer towards the central point of the new Reich Chancellery. The entrance portal, with its strong vertical lines, served to momentarily break the visual flow of the horizontal lines of the building. From here, the viewer's gaze is directed toward Mittelbau. Approximately 350 meters further west was the entrance portal of the western administration block. That portal was a mirror image of the one just described and served an identical purpose. Once again, the entrance portal served as a visual guide, directing the gaze of the viewer along the horizontal lines of the building, then up the pillars towards the eagle. The eagle's head was again turned to face Mittelbau. These eagles were the only decorative elements on the street facades of the new Reich Chancellery. Considering the way these facades were intended to be viewed, the lack of detailed decorative elements is understandable. Hitler was planning the mass motorization of Germany, and so the facades of the new Reich Chancellery were designed to be viewed not by walking but by driving past. By the time Germania had been completely constructed, Voss Street would have been widened to a 4-lane road. Should a guest of state then have arrived at the South Station, he would have been picked up by a convoy of cars, which would have brought him over the north-south axis and into Voss Street to enter the Court of Honor from Wilhelmplatz. From here, the view would not have been from the opposite carriageway as seen, but from the second lane of the extended Voss Street moving in the direction of the north-south axis, which would have been visible in the distance. But these expansions would only have been completed by 1950, by which time Albert Speer would have constructed an even newer Reichschancellery for Hitler, opposite the Reichstag. The new Reichschancellery would by then have been considered old and fit only as the party office for Rudolf Hess. But even though the new Reichschancellery was designed and constructed for the remodeled Berlin, Germania existed only on paper. Neither the north-south axis nor the widening and extension of Voss Street were ever realized. The facades facing Hermann Göring Street were also designed by Albert Speer in anticipation of Germania. The planned reorganization of the city included the extension of the Tiergarten up to Voss Street. The white barracks Speer built on Hermann Göring Street would have been visible from quite a distance within the park, and their almost residential architectural style would have suited this view. To differentiate this informal area of the Chancellery from the official government buildings, Speer used a different architectural style in its design. In this area, the architecture is far less ornate and imposing than that of the official building sectors. Behind inconspicuous steel gates was an access road from which 2 garages could be entered. The larger of the 2 garages can be seen on the left. Aside from space to house the fleet, it also contained workshops for the maintenance of the vehicles. In 1943, an underground air raid shelter was built in the garage. The rediscovery of this bunker in 1990 makes it the focal point of discussions on what should be done with the remaining architectural witnesses to the Nazi era. Directly opposite the entrance to the underground garage was a driveway which functioned as a service passage. This passage led through the Western Administration block to the courtyard in its center. delivery vehicles had direct access via this driveway to the delivery zone for the large cafeteria, which was located in the courtyard. But the passage was not only constructed as a supply access. The basement of the courtyard housed the Reich Chancellery's fire brigade. This meant that the passage connected the fire brigade to the garage, the place where the risk of fire was greatest. Here in the basement of the courtyard, shielded by the northern facade of the Western Administration Block, the fire brigade was protected from a possible fire in the opposite fleet garage, but was close enough to respond immediately should one break out. To the east of the driveway was the large courtyard of the Reich Chancellery. The barracks garden was connected to this courtyard by a passage. This provided the residents of the barracks with a direct access to the Reich Chancellery. The large courtyard did not really serve a practical purpose. Here, the garden of the Chancellery ended in a high wall which screened the courtyard from the view of the reception hall. Albert Speer designed the courtyard as a free space with the sole function of separating the garden facade of the new Reich Chancellery from the Western Administrative Block. The archway coming into view here was the only access into the large courtyard. This unobtrusive entrance was unusually subdued for the new Reich Chancellery, but is explained by the utilitarian character of this section of the building. The courtyard was only used by residents of the barracks to enter the Chancellery, and the driveway was only used by drivers and the fire brigade. None of the state guests or official visitors to the Reich Chancellery would ever see the garage and barracks, so the unadorned style was sufficient for drivers who would park in the underground garage and wait in the large cafeteria for the official receptions to end. In Albert Speer's building models, the passage, seen here to end in a blank wall, was supposed to lead through an opening in the pergola. This would have given direct access from the barracks to Hitler's living and working areas. The fact that this passage was not constructed as planned indicates that the decision to completely separate the barracks from the main area of the new Reich Chancellery was made on short notice when construction was already underway. The reason for this change in plans is unclear, but it is likely that Hitler's confidence in the domestic staff and the residents of the barracks, the SS-Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was already waning during the construction of the new Reich Chancellery. However, due to ongoing construction work in the Chancellery gardens, the pergola was never truly completed. Here, in the western part of the garden, it was enclosed with a brick wall. Presumably, this enclosed section was used for the storage of construction materials, and the brick wall served to screen the storage space from view and was intended to be temporary. Albert Speer built a greenhouse into the northern section of the pergola. The official name greenhouse, however, was rather misleading, as it seems that the building was not designed with that function in mind. The so-called greenhouse was in fact an orangery, a building typically found in the garden of an aristocratic palace. Like Speer's greenhouse, an orangery would be constructed in sight of the main building and provide a focal point to the gardens. This naming of the structure is an indication of Hitler's inconsistency. He wished to be surrounded by the opulence of a palace, but also to appear modest and practical. The ambiguity of the greenhouse is further emphasized by the two sculptures by the artists Gustinus Ambrosi and Louis Thierry. Aside from the fact that the statue bases were obviously not designed for these specific pieces, the sculptures were created by different artists who lived at different times. Their only common ground is that Hitler wanted to have both in his garden. Here, in the northeastern area of the garden, where the pergola met the reception hall, Albert Speer built additional housing for Reich Chancellery staff. This double-story building against the outer wall of the pergola was the so-called Haus Kempka, where Hitler's driver lived. A few meters behind the northern pergola was a wall across the entire length of the gardens. This wall was necessary because the pergola was never completely closed off as planned. The opening, which can be seen here, was left as a construction entrance, first for the completion of the new Reich Chancellery and later for the construction of the Führerbunker. From here in the garden, the large courtyard is visible, which was described earlier. However, from this point of view, the courtyard appears as an open space and not as an architectural element in its own right. Looking at the garden facade of the new Reich Chancellery, one gets the impression that it is a different building from the one previously seen from Voss Street. The garden portal was flanked by two bronze horses made by the Austrian sculptor Josef Thorak. These sculptures, along with the portico's color and form, served to further enhance its visual dominance. 5 doors with massive glass windows were located in the portal, and these connected Hitler's office with the main access view of the garden. The view of the garden was best seen from within Hitler's office. For this reason, guests of state would enter this room from within the Chancellery building. The office was the last in a series of representation rooms through which the guest would be led on his way to Hitler's office. The open view from the terrace, stretching over the gardens to the greenhouse, was a continuation of the visual experience of the foregoing rooms. The portal with its pillars formed an open-air continuation of Hitler's office by repeating the materials which were used inside the office. Decorations made of bronze, gold and marble are found only on this part of the entire exterior of the new Reich Chancellery. The garden portal alone displays lavish materials that were otherwise only reserved for the interior of the Chancellery. Here, Albert Speer crowned the marble columns with Egyptian plant capitals made of partially gilded bronze. These intricately shaped capitals, made of high-quality materials, marked the garden portal as the most important element of the new Reich Chancellery's facades. Like the Mittelbau in Voss Street, the garden facade of the new Reich Chancellery also had a visually excluding character. The entire facade was surrounded by a terrace wall approximately 3 meters high. The stairs leading to the terrace were located on the sides and integrated into the design in such a manner that they were not immediately apparent. This meant that there was no visual enticement to enter Hitler's study uninvited. A visitor moving unaccompanied in the garden would have had difficulty finding the small recessed steps. The dining hall, now coming into view on the left, was also designed by Albert Speer to have a forbidding visual character. However, to place the origin of the architecture of the dining hall in context, it is necessary to consider what preceded it. Here is the Bismarck Passage, built in 1875. This passage served to screen the Chancellery Gardens from the view of the rear of the houses located on the northern side of Voss Street. With the demolition of the houses on Voss Street, this passage became redundant, and Speer built the dining hall in its place. Furthermore, the extension that was built in the southwest wing of the old Reich Chancellery in 1928 was also changed. The historic Red Salon was integrated into the new Reich Chancellery by Speer, and its large windows continued to dominate the facade of the wing. The design of the new dining hall was clearly influenced by the form of the old Bismarck Passage. This is indicated not only by the repeated arches, but also by the way the building section sticks out from the main line of the Chancellery facade. The small windows on the second floor were those of a library. The windows, together with the massive stone arches, enhanced the appearance of a medieval castle. There was only one access to this building from the garden, and it was hidden between the terrace of the main facade and the dining hall itself. Like Hitler's office, the dining hall was also designed to have the greatest visual impact when viewed from inside. While the architecture would seem forbidding from the gardens, when viewed from inside, the atmosphere would have been one of protection. Here, at the end of the dining hall, where the old Reich Chancellery met the new Reich Chancellery, Speer's challenge was not only the design and structure of the building. Far more important was to find a way to create an integrated whole from the old and the new building sections. He achieved this by the same method he applied in Voss Street, by letting the height of the existing structure dictate the height of the new building. In Voss Street, Speer let the height of the over 400-meter-long new Reich Chancellery match that of the existing Borsigpalais. Here on the garden side of the building, he repeated the height and shape of the roof of the old Reich Chancellery along the entire garden facade of the new building. The garden just described was not a part of the public sector of the building. The view of the barracks was screened by the pergola, and the gardens could not be seen or directly accessed from the street. This set the gardens apart as part of Hitler's personal domain. While the street facades were modest to enhance the appearance of the Chancellery as an ordinary government office, the garden facades showed the true character of the building. No other building better reflected the ambiguity of Hitler himself. To the German people, he wished to appear a simple, hard-working citizen with no use for gold and ostentatious decorations, but as a statesman, he wanted a residence with richly decorated galleries and palatial facades to underline his claim to power. If one walks down Voss Street today, nothing remains to indicate that this was once the location of the new Reich Chancellery. Just as little is left of the Berlin Wall, which crossed its foundations for 40 years. Since the demolition of the wall, the area is once again a building site. On the western side of the Reich Chancellery today, the embassies of the German federal states can be found. The building of the Jewish publisher Rudolf Mosse was used by the Nazi government after Mosse fled Germany. This building was destroyed during the war, and now, years later, a modern Palais Mosse has found a place on Voss Street again. The eastern part of the grounds is today covered by the prefabricated low-cost apartments erected by the GDR government after 1988. It is hoped that one day there will again be buildings in this area that can match the architectural quality of their predecessors. With the construction of the new Reich Chancellery, the original extension building was also converted by Speer. The bronze doors, which led to the driveway, were also designed to create a strong and unbreachable appearance, as they formed the official entrance to the Reich Chancellery. However, the renovations did not enhance the architectural appearance of the building as a whole. The visual balance and clear lines of the original building were destroyed, and despite objections by the original architect, Professor Eduard Jobst Siedler, the building was fundamentally changed by Speer's attachment of the Führerbalkon and the construction of the driveway. Since it was enclosed by 4 sets of double doors, 2 on Wilhelmplatz and 2 in the Court of Honor, the passage effectively became a room in its own right. The ceiling of the passage was slightly curved and shaped so that an interior ledge would form a small overhang. Soft lights were placed in the resulting niches and directed towards the ceiling to provide indirect illumination. The resulting neutrally lit passage seemed like a lock through which a visitor moved from the public Wilhelmplatz and into the private world of Hitler. The Court of Honor was not built in a straight line to stand perpendicular to the extension building. Thus, the passage that connected Wilhelmplatz with the court was tilted slightly to the right to reorient a visitor so that he would enter the Court of Honor aligned to the visual axis. The Court of Honor served as an entrance hall to a series of rooms which culminated in the Great Reception Hall and Hitler's office. Since many of the receptions were held in the evening, Speer placed lights in the Court of Honor to enhance its architecture at night. This nighttime lighting was almost an inversion of the natural daylight, as areas that would normally be in the shadow during the day were brightly lit at night. Through the use of artificial light, Speer was able to emphasize the most important sections of the Court of Honor. Speer also used the artificial light to make the new Reich Chancellery seem larger than it was. Those who entered the Chancellery in daylight and left at night would have seen the Court of Honor so changed that they would get the impression that they left the building through a separate exit. Flanking the entrance portal were two sculptures by the sculptor Arno Breke. The piece seen here to the right of the entrance was called the Sword Carrier. Breke intended it to symbolize the protection a nation requires. Adolf Hitler wanted a more symbolic name and renamed the sculpture Wehrmacht. The sculptures were not originally commissioned for the new Reich Chancellery, and so Breke had already named them, when Albert Speer chose them for the Court of Honor. The piece to the left of the entrance portal was called the Torch-Bearer, and was intended by Breke to symbolize the spirit in which a nation should be led. But even this name was not symbolic enough for Hitler. He renamed it simply the Party. With the sculptures Party and Wehrmacht, Hitler wished to symbolize the inseparable unity of the Party and the Wehrmacht in the German Reich. The entire new Reich Chancellery was actually a stage set of symbols. The impressive facades were only very rarely indicative of what lay behind them. Even the design of the facades of the Court of Honor enforced the impression of monumental importance. One would expect that behind these windows lay large conference rooms where major political decisions were made. But this impression was just a mirage. Most of these windows led only to corridors, some small offices, and even to toilet facilities. In the light of this, it is not so surprising that the entrance to Hitler's private quarters was hidden as inconspicuously as possible in a niche of the Court of Honor. It was not the Court of Honor, or the endless lavishly decorated rooms, or even the office he never used, that was actually important. It was rather this inconspicuous passage, which led to a small covered courtyard, that was truly significant. Here one entered the private realm of the man at the helm of responsibility. When Hitler came to Berlin, this courtyard is where his driver would have brought him. From here, he had direct access to the old and the new Reich Chancellery. This small courtyard formed a hub from which Hitler's driver could reach every imposing official entrance to the Reich Chancellery. Behind the gate, coming into view on the right, was a passage through which he could drive directly into the court of the old Reich Chancellery. The garages here in the eastern section of the courtyard contained Hitler's private fleet. From here, the exit of the Court of Honor could also be directly accessed. The new Reich Chancellery was the only building Albert Speer designed for Germania that was ever completed. Here he tested the materials and construction methods he intended to use in the construction of the monumental buildings for the new Berlin. But these plans never came to fruition, and all that could ever be shown of the vast plans Hitler and Speer held for the future was a room full of wooden models.